Welcome to the deep dive. In a world where hand sanitizer is, well, everywhere, we're looking closer at something that's more than just careful hygiene.
Mm,
Mysophobia, or as most people probably know it, germophobia.
exactly.
What happens when being clean tips over into um, a real consuming fear? That's what we want to unpack today.
Yeah, precisely. We're diving into that pathological fear of contamination of germs. And it's interesting, there are actually several names for it.
Oh,
You might hear verminophobia, bacillophobia, bacteriophobia too. They mostly overlap now, focusing on that core fear of germs, though historically there might have been slightly different shades of meaning, like vermin versus specific bacteria.
pathological fear.
Mm,
That's the important bit, isn't it? It's
eh,
not just, liking a tidy desk.
right.
Where does that normal preference cross the line?
That's the crucial distinction. Mysophobia is classed as a specific phobia, and the diagnosis, it really hangs on the intensity of the reaction.
Oh.
It means feeling really high levels of fear, anxiety, when you're actually exposed to germs or even just thinking about being exposed.
Right, the anticipation too.
Yes, and critically, that fear level is way out of proportion to the actual real danger and, what's considered normal in your culture or environment.
So it's that mismatch, the perceived threat versus the reality. That's the signal. It was interesting, though, the term itself isn't brand new.
No, not at all. Mysophobia was coined way back in 1879
Wow, okay.
by William A. Hammond. And interestingly, he wasn't describing it quite like we do now as a standalone phobia. He used it for a case of what we'd now probably call OCD.
Obsessive compulsive disorder.
Exactly, someone with obsessive hand-washing compulsions.
Right. Okay. Fast forward to today. We see a whole range of behaviors linked to this intense fear. What sort of things might someone with mysophobia typically do?
Well, you see a lot of behaviors aimed at avoiding exposure or perceived exposure, like excessive hand-washing is a big one.
To the point where it causes problems itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes causing skin damage,
Yeah.
or people might constantly wear gloves or, cover things up even when there's really minimal risk.
Hmm.
And a really significant pattern is avoiding social situations, avoiding public places, just to try and cut down the chances of encountering germs.
It's not just what people do, is it?
Yeah.
There's a physical side to this fear, too.
Oh, definitely. When someone with mysophobia encounters something they see as contaminated, their body can react strongly.
Like a panic attack.
It can feel like that. You get the classic anxiety symptoms. Feeling lightheaded, heart racing, sweating, sometimes shaking.
That sounds incredibly disruptive. So the big question with phobias is often, why? What do we actually know about where mysophobia comes from?
Honestly, like a lot of specific phobias, the precise causes aren't fully understood. It's complex.
Right.
But the general thinking is that it's probably an interplay between, say, genetic factors, maybe a predisposition to anxiety, and environmental triggers, life experiences.
Kind of a nature and nurture mix.
Pretty much, yeah. Some people might just be more vulnerable, and then certain experiences can set off the phobia.
Okay, that makes sense. The material also brought up classical conditioning. How does that fit in?
Right, so classical conditioning gives us one way to think about how these fears might develop. Imagine something totally neutral, like, I don't know, touching a doorknob.
Okay.
Now imagine that happens around the same time you get really sick, like a bad flu.
Mm-hmm.
Your brain can basically forge a link, a strong negative emotional connection between the doorknob and feeling ill and anxious.
So the doorknob itself becomes scary.
Exactly. That association gets learned, gets ingrained, and then just touching a doorknob can trigger the fear even long after the flu is gone. The brain's learned to fear something that was originally harmless.
That's a powerful learning process.
Yeah.
The sources also mentioned links to other conditions.
Yes, there's research suggesting an association. People diagnosed with mysophobia might also have other mental health disorders,
Like,
particularly other anxiety disorders. And going back to Hammond, obsessive compulsive disorder is often seen alongside it. It's not always cause and effect, but they often co-occur.
okay. Now this next part I found really fascinating. The potential link between how much we understand about microbes and how much time we spend in nature.
Yeah, this is a really interesting angle.
How might those things relate to mysophobia?
Well, one idea is that our fear might actually be linked to perhaps a lack of understanding.
How so?
Some research suggests a connection between mysophobia and maybe a limited grasp of just how diverse microbes are. Someone doesn't realize that most microbes are actually harmless or even beneficial.
I might just see all germs as bad.
Exactly. They might overgeneralize the threat. And then there's a nature exposure aspect. Less time spent in natural environments has also been linked to a higher chance of mysophobia.
Why would that be?
Well, think about it evolutionarily. Humans spent millennia in constant contact with dirt, soil, the natural world. Maybe our modern, super sanitized lives are disrupting a natural learning process.
Learning to tell the difference between harmful and harmless microbes.
Potentially, yeah. And that could lead to this kind of overblown fear response. It's a compelling thought.
It really is. It suggests our relationship with the microscopic world is maybe more complex than just good versus bad.
Yeah.
So, okay, if someone is struggling with this, what help is out there? What are the main treatments?
Thankfully, there are effective options. A big one is cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT.
Oh, yeah.
CBT helps people identify and challenge those negative thought patterns that fuel the phobia and learn better coping strategies.
And what about facing the fear itself?
That's where exposure therapy comes in. This is another key treatment. It involves gradually, safely exposing the person to the things or situations they fear.
Bit by bit.
Yes, in a controlled way. The goal is to help them learn through experience that these things aren't as dangerous as they feel and to reduce that anxiety response over time.
Does medication play a role?
It can. Pharmaceuticals can be helpful, especially for managing the really acute symptoms like panic attacks. Things like beta blockers or benzodiazepines might be used. But it's really important to stress medication often works best alongside therapy, not usually as the only long-term answer.
Right, and the reading mentioned broader stress reduction things too.
Yeah, absolutely. Things like yoga, meditation,
Mm-hmm.
they can be really valuable for just general anxiety management.
Not a cure for the phobia itself, but helpful overall.
Exactly. They don't target the mysophobia directly, but lowering overall anxiety can definitely help someone cope better. And there are other therapies too. Virtual reality therapy, hypnosis, family therapy, supportive therapy. They all aim to help the person see the feared thing isn't actually dangerous.
So how does a doctor or therapist actually decide, yes, this is mysophobia? What are the specific criteria they look for?
Okay, so since it's a specific phobia in the DSM-5, the diagnosis follows set criteria. First, there has to be that clear, almost automatic link between germs or contamination and feeling fear or anxiety.
Consistent reaction.
Yes, exposure pretty much always triggers immediate fear. And crucially, like we said before, that fear has to be unreasonable, out of proportion to the actual risk, considering the situation and cultural norms.
Right. What's normal hygiene in one place might be extreme elsewhere.
Exactly. What else? Well, the person either actively avoids the feared situations or objects, or if they can't avoid them, they endure them but with really intense distress.
And it has to actually impact their life.
Yes, that's key. The fear, anxiety, or avoidance has to cause significant distress or impairment in their daily life, social life, work, school, whatever's important.
How long does it need to last?
It needs to be persistent. Typically, the criteria say for at least 6 months.
Okay.
And finally, the symptoms shouldn't be better explained by some other mental disorder like OCD, even though, as we said, they can be related, need to rule out other primary causes.
Sounds like a pretty thorough assessment.
Mm.
Now, what about how common it is? Do we know how many people actually have mysophobia?
That's interesting, actually. There isn't a huge amount of solid data on the general prevalence. It's hard to get exact numbers for the whole population.
So we don't really know the full scale.
Not precisely. But we do know, as discussed, it's linked with other anxiety disorders, like OCD. And one study did find higher rates of severe phobias, including mysophobia, in women who already had a diagnosed mental illness.
And there was that suggestion. Could germophobia, or at least anxieties about germs, be increasing lately?
Yeah, that's a perspective some people hold. The idea is that maybe factors like increased focus on hygiene, perhaps linked to worries about immune disorders from too little exposure early on.
The hygiene hypothesis idea,
Sort of related to that, yeah.
Yeah.
And then you layer on big events like the COVID-19 pandemic.
which definitely heightened everyone's awareness of germs.
Right. So it's possible these things might be contributing to more germ-related anxiety in the population overall. Not necessarily diagnosed mysophobia skyrocketing, but maybe more general worry.
It's hard to deny that global events shape our anxieties, isn't it? Changing gears slightly, the name itself, mysophobia, is pretty direct, right?
It is, yeah. Comes straight from Greek. Mysos means uncleanness.
And phobos.
Phobos is fear. So literally, fear of uncleanness. Pretty straightforward.
And finally, the sources listed some famous people who were, well, reputed to have had mysophobia.
Yeah.
Need to be careful here, as these aren't clinical diagnoses.
Absolutely. That's a very important caveat. These are based on reports, biographies, public image.
Right. But who was mentioned?
Well, the list included figures like Adolf Hitler, Howard Stern, Nikola Tesla, Howard Hughes, also Howie Mandel, Saddam Hussein, and Donald Trump.
Quite a range.
It is, again, based on reputation, but it does sort of illustrate how this kind of fear isn't confined to any one type of person, even anecdotally.
Definitely adds another layer.
Hmm.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. We really dug into mysophobia today, that significant fear of germs, contamination.
Hmm.
We looked at its different names, how it's classified as a specific phobia based on that intense, often irrational fear.
We talked about the behaviors, like the excessive cleaning or avoidance, and the physical symptoms that can kick in the anxiety response.
Right, and the causes, likely that mix of genetics and environment, with classical conditioning offering one model for how the fear might develop.
And its links to other conditions like anxiety disorders and OCD, plus that really intriguing potential connection to our understanding of microbes and maybe our reduced exposure to nature.
Then we covered the treatments, CBT, exposure therapy being key, potentially medication, and general stress management.
We went through the formal diagnostic criteria from the DSM-5, ensuring it's a persistent, impairing, unreasonable fear, not better explained by something else.
Touched on prevalence, hard to pin down exactly, but associations exist, and maybe societal anxieties about germs are higher recently.
Yeah, and we looked at the simple Greek roots of the word and mentioned some famous figures often associated with it, bearing in mind that's based on reputation.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, it really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? About that line between sensible hygiene and a fear that takes over your life.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of prompts you to consider your own relationship with cleanliness, maybe, and with that whole invisible world of microbes all around us. It's this fascinating mix of psychology, biology, and just everyday life.